The West spins a tale, a simple, comforting tale. NATO, they say, is a shield. It exists solely for defense, it protects its members from aggression. This narrative is repeated endlessly, it echoes in halls of power, it fills the airwaves. Many believe this story. They accept it without question. But this narrative is a carefully constructed illusion. It masks a far more complex and often troubling reality. The truth about NATO is not so benign. Its motives are not always pure. We are told NATO is a beacon of stability, a force for peace in a turbulent world. Its expansion, they claim, spreads democracy. It secures freedom. These are noble ideals. They appeal to our best instincts. Yet, history often tells a different story. A story of power, not just principles. A story of interests, not just ideals. The claim of a purely defensive alliance crumbles under scrutiny. It does not align with the alliance's actions. It does not explain its relentless growth. The mainstream portrayal of NATO deliberately omits crucial facts. It ignores inconvenient truths. The alliance's decisions are presented as consensual. Yet one nation's influence often looms largest: the United States. NATO was born in 1949. The official reason was clear: to deter Soviet aggression in Europe. The Cold War was dawning. Fear was palpable. The Soviet Union seemed a monolithic threat. A defensive pact appeared logical, necessary even. This is the story told in textbooks. This is the justification offered. But the geopolitical chessboard was more complex. The motives were not solely about defense against an imminent Soviet invasion. There were deeper currents at play. The United States emerged from World War II as a superpower. It sought to shape the post-war world. It aimed to contain Soviet influence, certainly, but it also aimed to project its own power. NATO became a crucial instrument for this. It anchored American military presence in Europe. It solidified Western European alignment with Washington. It was about creating a sphere of influence, a Western bloc under American leadership. This was as much about power projection as it was about collective defense. The idea that NATO was purely reactive is misleading. It was also proactive. The Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. A new era dawned. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev sought cooperation. He was given assurances. Explicit assurances from Western leaders. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker was clear. NATO would not expand eastward. This was a serious pledge, a promise made at a pivotal moment in history. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not seen as an end, not by everyone. For some in the West, it was an opportunity. A golden opportunity for NATO to expand its reach. The promises made to Gorbachev were quickly forgotten, or perhaps they were never intended to be kept. The strategic imperative of Western dominance reasserted itself. The lure of expanding influence proved too strong. The Eastward March began, relentlessly, systematically, ignoring Russian concerns. Despite the clear assurances, the expansion started. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO in 1999. These were former Warsaw Pact nations, nations once firmly in the Soviet sphere. Their inclusion was a significant step, a clear signal of intent. Russia watched with growing alarm. This was not the partnership it had envisioned. This felt like encirclement, a deliberate move to diminish its influence, to push Western military power closer to its borders. The expansion did not stop there. In 2004, a major wave occurred. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, joined. These were former Soviet republics. Their accession was particularly sensitive for Moscow. NATO forces were now directly on Russia's northwestern frontier. Section 5, Yugoslavia's Agony, a precedent carved in fire. The year was 1999. NATO launched Operation Allied Force, a 78-day bombing campaign against Yugoslavia. The official reason was humanitarian, to prevent ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, to protect Kosovar Albanians from Serbian forces. This was the narrative presented to the world, a noble cause, a necessary intervention. But the reality was far more complex and far more controversial. The bombing set a dangerous precedent. It showed NATO's willingness to act outside international law. The intervention lacked UN Security Council approval. Russia and China, permanent members, opposed it. This was a significant departure. NATO, a supposedly defensive alliance, initiated offensive military action against a sovereign nation, a nation that had not attacked any NATO member. This was not defense. This was an act of aggression, dressed in humanitarian garb. Section 6. Libya's descent. Interventions, chaos unleashed. The year 2011 saw another chapter. NATO intervened in Libya. UN Security Council Resolution 1973 was cited. The stated goal was to protect civilians, to prevent Muammar Gaddafi's forces from committing atrocities. The Arab Spring was in full bloom. Hopes were high for democratic change. NATO presented its role as limited, a no-fly zone, protection of civilians. But the mission quickly morphed. It became an active campaign for regime change. The intervention went far beyond its UN mandate. NATO air power became the decisive factor. It supported rebel forces on the ground. It targeted Gaddafi's regime directly. The aim shifted from protecting civilians to overthrowing a leader. This was mission creep on a grand scale. Several nations, including Russia, China, Brazil, India, and South Africa, criticized this overreach. They argued NATO was exceeding its authority. They warned of unintended consequences. Their warnings were ignored. The overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi was achieved, but what followed was not stability, not democracy. Libya descended into chaos. Civil war erupted. Rival militias carved up the country. Extremist groups gained a foothold. The state collapsed. It became a failed state. Section 7 Iraq, the War of Choice and NATO's Complicity. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was not an official NATO operation. This is an important distinction. However, it cannot be divorced from NATO's story. Key NATO members led the charge, the United States and the United Kingdom. They formed the coalition of the willing. Many other NATO members provided support, logistical, political, or with troop contributions later. The invasion was based on false pretenses, claims of weapons of mass destruction, links to Al-Qaeda. These claims were later proven untrue. The war in Iraq was a war of choice, not a war of necessity. It lacked UN Security Council authorization. It was a clear violation of international law, yet powerful NATO states pursued it. This action deeply divided the alliance itself. France and Germany notably opposed the invasion, but the willingness of its most powerful members to act unilaterally, or with a select coalition, spoke volumes. It showed that the alliance framework could be bypassed, when core US strategic interests were at stake. The consequences of the Iraq War were catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, millions displaced, the rise of ISIS. Section 8, Russia's Red Lines Provocation at the Eastern Gates. NATO's posture towards Russia has become increasingly confrontational, especially after 2014 and Russia's actions in Ukraine. The alliance frames its moves as defensive, as responses to Russian aggression. But Moscow sees a different picture. It sees a pattern of deliberate provocation, a steady encroachment on its security interests, a breaking of the spirit, if not the letter, of past understandings. The deployment of NATO forces in the Baltic states and Poland is a key example. Starting in 2016, 4 multinational NATO battle groups were deployed, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. These are presented as deterrence, as reassurance for Eastern allies. Russia views them as a direct military threat, positioned right on its borders. The Aegis Ashore missile defense system in Romania is another point of contention. NATO claims it is defensive, aimed at threats from outside the Euro-Atlantic area, not directed at Russia. Moscow does not believe this. It sees a system that could be repurposed, a threat to its own nuclear deterrent. NATO's rhetoric and actions concerning Georgia and Ukraine are also highly provocative. Section 9, Beyond the Facade, Unmasking NATO's True Agenda. The mainstream narrative persists. NATO is a defensive alliance. It safeguards peace and democracy. Its actions are always justified, morally sound, legally grounded. This comforting story is repeated by Western governments. It is amplified by a compliant media. But this narrative is a dangerous fiction. It obscures the alliance's true nature, its role as an instrument of Western, primarily American, geopolitical power. Its history is replete with actions that contradict its defensive claims. The evidence is compelling. Broken promises of no eastward expansion, military interventions without UN mandates in Yugoslavia and Libya, the complicity of key members in the disastrous Iraq War, the relentless military buildup on Russia's borders. These are not the actions of a purely defensive entity. These are the actions of a power bloc, a bloc determined to maintain and expand its dominance, to shape the global order according to its interests, regardless of the consequences for others. Gorbachev was led to believe in a different future, a future of a common European home, a security architecture that included Russia, not excluded it. This vision was betrayed. Instead, NATO chose expansion. it chose confrontation.